Australia is in the grips of a well-documented housing crisis as home prices continue to climb with demand still outstripping supply.
We're expecting all capital cities to see house and unit prices at fresh records, and we are also forecasting Sydney's median house price to hit just over $1.9 million by the end of next year, so that really does set the pathway for a $2 million median house price in Sydney by 2027.
14 times the annual disposable income, making it the world's second most expensive city to buy property.
You've got about 120,000 properties on the market for sale right now, whereas usually this time of year the 5-year average would be 150,000. So rising demand against tight supply is continuing to see a rise in home values.
Rules of the game have not been properly set and have been based entirely on profit rather than balanced with the needs of people.
Here's the number that should terrify every Australian under 45. Exactly half. According to a comprehensive survey of over 1,000 Australians aged 18 to 35, only 20% believe they are very likely to ever own a home. The remaining 50% are formally categorised as either unsure or entirely pessimistic about ever achieving home ownership. Not delayed, not difficult, never. This isn't about saving harder or making better choices. The mathematics of the Australian property market have permanently excluded half the population from ownership. And here's where it gets worse. This isn't a problem that affects some abstract demographic you don't know. Right now, 53% of young Australians are paying more than 30% of their income just on rent, the textbook definition of housing stress. But the truly devastating figure is this. 27% are paying more than half of their entire income to prevent eviction. Half of everything they earn. Just to keep a roof over their heads. Every fortnight, before they've bought groceries, paid utilities, or put petrol in the car, more than a quarter of young Australians have already handed over half their pay to a landlord. In this video, I'm breaking down exactly why half of Australians will never own property. The policy decisions that created this crisis by design, how the government's own documents admit they're going to miss their housing targets by 300,000 homes, and what the experts are predicting for 2026 and beyond. Let's get into it.
Labor members and MPs admitting that Labor aren't doing enough on the housing crisis. It is well past time for Labor to come to the table, stop with the petty politics, and let's work out a plan to actually start to tackle the scale of the crisis.
Right. Let me show you what this crisis actually looks like in people's wallets, because the statistics only matter if you can feel them. The Home in Place Exit Generation survey revealed that due entirely to housing costs, 21% of young Australians have intentionally delayed major life milestones. They're not having children. They're not getting married. They're not pursuing further education. Not because they don't want to, but because the maths doesn't maths when you're handing over half your pay to a landlord. The decision to start a family, to build a life, to pursue a career change, all of these fundamental human experiences are being cancelled because the rent is due. And here's the statistic that gave this generation its name. The crisis has reached such a breaking point that over half, 53%, are actively considering leaving Australia altogether to find affordable housing overseas. They're not daydreaming about backpacking through Europe. They're researching permanent emigration to New Zealand, Canada, parts of Asia, anywhere that hasn't structurally excluded an entire generation from property ownership. They've run the numbers and concluded that the country of their birth has decided they're not welcome in the housing market. That's why researchers have officially labelled them the exit generation. An entire cohort of Australians considering exile because their own country won't let them buy a home.
I don't think anyone has referred to mortgage deductibility for first home buyers in the past because it has not been a topic of conversation.
Meanwhile, a full 25%, 1 in 4 young adults, remain trapped living in their childhood bedrooms with their parents. Not temporarily while they save for a deposit. Not strategically building a war chest, unable to afford even the entry costs of the private rental market, let alone a mortgage. Meant these are adults in their late 20s and early 30s, sleeping in the same room they had as teenagers because the rental market requires a deposit, references, and a perfect application just to secure a lease on a one-bedroom apartment. Now, some might think the solution is simple. Just move to the regions. Get out of Sydney and Melbourne. Find somewhere affordable. The politicians love this line. But the research destroys that myth completely. No, a regional media analysis documented a renter attempting to relocate to Deniliquin, a small town in regional New South Wales with a population of about 7,000 people.
The system is working as intended, a punitive system designed to entrench a permanent underclass. Housing is designed by politicians as an investment, so the goal is money over people. This is not living but existing.
Real estate agents informed the prospective tenant that the town's vacancy rate was effectively close to zero. They were forced to join waitlists with 6 different agencies simultaneously just to secure basic shelter in a country town most Australians couldn't point to on a map. But the crisis has metastasised into every corner of the country. Regional Australia, which was supposed to be the affordable alternative, is now competing with the capital cities for the title of most impossible rental market. There is no escape route. There is no just move somewhere cheaper. Cheaper doesn't exist anymore. To be fair, not everyone in this demographic is completely locked out. Some young Australians have managed to secure mortgages through family assistance, inheritance, or exceptional income circumstances. The Bank of Mum and Dad is now effectively Australia's 5th largest mortgage lender.
The Greens policy that we propose, that our leader Adam Ban proposed at a national press club recently, was to phase out negative gearing for people with more than one investment property and scrap capital gains tax discounts to raise $74 billion over the next 10 years.
But here's what the data shows about the lucky ones who did manage to get in. 47% of current mortgage holders are severely over-indebted. Nearly half of everyone who has a mortgage is drowning in it. They're not building wealth. They're not accumulating equity. They're living paycheck to paycheck, one interest rate rise or one job loss away from losing everything. The system has created 2 distinct tragic classes among young Australians. Generation Rent, the completely locked out 50% who will never own, and the working poor, the dangerously over-leveraged who live on the knife edge of insolvency just to participate in the Australian dream. Neither group is winning. One group is locked outside the gate. The other group got through the gate and found themselves in a debt trap. But here's what nobody is telling you. This crisis wasn't an accident. It wasn't a natural disaster or an unpredictable market fluctuation. The government's own advisory council has already admitted they're going to miss their housing targets by nearly 300,000 homes. And I can prove it with their own documents. The National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, the government's own independent advisory body, published a report that contains the ultimate smoking gun. Page 184 explicitly states that new housing supply will only total 903,000 dwellings during the accord period from July 2024 to June 2029. The politicians stand at press conferences and publicly tout the accord's target of 1.2 million homes. But their own modelling, buried in their own reports, confirms a shortfall of nearly 300,000 dwellings. The 1.2 million figure is a phantom statistic designed for press conferences and election campaigns, not actual housing delivery. Now, the government knows the target is impossible. Their own advisors have told them in writing, and they keep saying it anyway. And the political theatre around this failure is extraordinary. In a combative ABC debate between Housing Minister Claire O'Neill and Shadow Minister Michael Sukkar, the Shadow Minister was asked 3 separate times to commit to the 1.2 million home target. He repeatedly refused. At one point, he stated on camera, "Life is easier when you set a target you know you're not going to meet." Let that sink in. The man who would be housing minister in an alternative government openly admitted on national television that the entire target system is political fiction. Both sides know the numbers are fake. They just don't care because the people affected can't afford to donate to election campaigns. When pressed on exact funding amounts for social housing, Sukkar provided what the anchor described as exceptionally vague assurances, promising to deliver as much as is coming out of the HAFF, but refusing to name a dollar figure or dwelling count. This prompted the anchor to interject forcefully. "No one's heard a number yet from you." The same debate featured another chaotic exchange where Minister O'Neill accused the previous government of building just 350 social homes in 9 years. Sukkar called the claim utterly incorrect, but under sustained pressure admitted on camera that he had provided a wrong figure in a previous press conference. The credibility of the entire political apparatus was demolished in a single television segment. The Grattan Institute, Australia's premier domestic policy think tank, confirms that states will substantially undershoot their per capita share of even the baseline 1 million home target. The federal government sets targets. The state governments control the zoning laws required to actually build, and neither level is delivering. Meanwhile, the punitive taxation measures being implemented by state governments are making the crisis worse, not better. The Victorian government has expanded the vacant residential land tax to 1% of the capital improved value for all of Victoria by 2026, a Vancouver-style enforcement mechanism designed to force supply onto the market. In New South Wales, the 2026 land tax rate has been set at 1.6% plus $100 on combined taxable land over the $1,075,000 threshold. These escalating holding costs don't magically create housing. They get passed directly to the tenant class in the form of structural rent increases. Greens MP Max Chandler Mather has become the loudest voice in Parliament, excoriating the government for these failures. In raw parliamentary footage, he stated that millions of Australians are one more rent increase away from homelessness. He noted that the federal budget provided just over $1 a day for people on rent assistance, nothing for the 5.5 million renters that don't get rent assistance. And here's the most devastating number I've been holding back. The Home in Place 1 in 10 campaign revealed that 10,000 people per month are becoming homeless in Australia. Not annually, monthly. To 10,000 Australians every single month losing their homes and joining the ranks of the homeless. And among them are the hidden homeless, a phenomenon that barely existed a decade ago. Fully employed essential workers like nurses, teachers, and police officers who are forced to sleep in their cars because their salaries cannot cover local rents. These aren't people who made bad decisions. These are people who did everything society asked of them and still got locked out. The campaign explicitly labels the government's reliance on private developers a catastrophic failure. It notes a devastating historical contrast that should make every Australian question what happened to this country. While governments built 15% of all new homes in the 1950s and 60s, today they build almost none. The government has completely abandoned its role as a provider of housing and handed the entire system to a private market that has no incentive to build affordable homes. This isn't just an Australian phenomenon. The crisis has gone global, and the international data shows our problems are part of a systemic failure across the entire Western world. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies reports that the median existing home price in the United States has reached a shocking 5 times the median household income, completely abandoning the historical ratio of 3 that economists considered sustainable for generations. The same pattern is emerging in Canada, the UK, Ireland, and New Zealand. Young people across the English-speaking world are being locked out of property ownership simultaneously. Apollo Academy's analysis shows apartment deliveries are declining significantly in 2025 and 2026 globally, putting upward pressure on rents across all Western economies. The construction pipeline is stalling exactly when it needs to be accelerating. Builders can't afford to build. Buyers can't afford to buy. And the governments that could intervene have decided that property prices are more important than housing their citizens. Meanwhile, the downstream effects in Australia are becoming catastrophic, particularly for the most vulnerable. The Mercy Care Parity Report delivers a devastating statistic that should haunt every policymaker who claims to care about young Australians. 28,000 young Australians aged 12 to 24 years are without a home each night, with over 39,000 presenting alone to specialist homelessness services seeking assistance. These are children, these are teenagers, these are young adults at the beginning of their lives who have already been failed so completely by the system that they're sleeping rough or couch surfing just to survive. And here's a cliff edge that almost nobody is talking about, one that's going to make 2026 even worse than the data already suggests. The National Rental Affordability Scheme, introduced in 2010 to develop 50,000 affordable homes, will completely end in 2026. The Senate submission on the worsening rental crisis warns that rents from the 31,600 tenancies currently under this scheme are likely to increase significantly as the 10-year period of subsidy expires. Over 30,000 households are about to see their rents spike at the exact moment the broader market is already at breaking point. The current 640,000 households in severe housing need are forecast to explode to 940,000 households by 2041. This trajectory proves 2026 is merely the tipping point, not the destination. The crisis is actively accelerating, and nothing in current policy settings will stop it. The Victorian government is attempting to force density into established suburbs through activity centre plans in areas like Broadmeadows, Ringwood and North Essendon. The mandate is to build 60,000 new homes by 2051 across 10 pilot centres. But even these aggressive top-down zoning changes can't overcome the fundamental economics. Builders can't make the numbers work when land tax, construction costs and interest rates have all surged simultaneously. So what do the experts predict for 2026? If you're waiting for a crash to fix this, if you're holding out hope that the market will correct and suddenly become affordable, the data says you'll be waiting forever. Tim Lawless, head of research at CoreLogic and the most recognised face in Australian property data analysis, thoroughly dismisses the false hope of a market crash. He explicitly notes that while value growth may become softer and more uneven, the persistently low inventory levels and resilient labour market provide a strong buffer against any material downturn. There is no crash coming.
Go back to, say, the last major recession we had back in the early 1990s. Back then, we're still seeing the RBA without an inflation mandate. So inflation was a lot more volatile, interest rate or policy was a lot more volatile.
The floor under property prices is made of structural undersupply, and that floor isn't going anywhere. Here's the devastating paradox that proves the system is working against first home buyers by design. The 2026 environment will face a 25 basis point rate hike and strict new PRA restrictions on high debt-to-income lending. These regulations were supposedly designed to cool the market and protect borrowers. But in practice, they're simultaneously destroying the borrowing capacity of first home buyers, while institutional investors with existing equity remain completely unaffected. The medicine is killing the patient while leaving the disease untouched. Dr. Shane Oliver, AMP's chief economist, confirms that established investors are aggressively crowding out desperate first home buyers. His widely circulated 7 Key Charts report states unequivocally that the Australian housing cycle is turning up again, driven by a chronic undersupply of between 200,000 and 300,000 dwellings. His November 2025 analysis shows housing credit growth is accelerating rapidly, driven mainly by investor lending, not first home buyer activity. Translation: those who already own capital are voraciously consuming the remaining supply. Every property an investor buys is a property a first home buyer misses out on. And the data shows investors are winning that competition decisively, leaving the 50% locked out permanently. The most chilling forecast comes from property strategists analysing long-term market cycles. Their warning to anyone waiting for a crash is blunt. You're going to lose the next 2 decades. The analysis frames 2026 not as a cyclical market top that will eventually correct, but as the nascent stage of a massive 15 to 25-year housing expansion. This expansion is underwritten by an unstoppable $82 trillion intergenerational wealth transfer from baby boomers to their children, locked-in equity from older demographics who bought decades ago, and a supply crisis that has now become a permanent feature of federal policy. The 50% lockout isn't a temporary bug in the system. It's the system working exactly as currently designed. Here's who this crisis actually matters to. If you're a renter currently paying more than 30% of your income on housing, you're officially in housing stress, and the data suggests relief isn't coming. If you're a young Australian who has delayed having children, getting married, or pursuing education because of housing costs, you're part of the 21% whose life decisions have been hijacked by this market. If you're a first home buyer hoping interest rate cuts will open a window, then understand that investor lending is accelerating and will absorb any new borrowing capacity before you reach the auction. If you're a parent watching your adult children trapped in their childhood bedroom or considering emigration, the Exit Generation survey confirms this isn't personal failure. It's structural exclusion by design. And if you're an established property owner wondering why your children can't replicate your success, the Grattan Institute data shows your generation increased its non-housing wealth, while the younger generation was forced into permanent, wealth-draining tenancy. Here's the truth. The 2026 housing crisis isn't characterized by a sudden crash or revolutionary reset. It's characterized by the quiet, bureaucratic, and permanent stratification of society into a landed gentry and an indentured tenant class. The government's own documents admit they'll miss their targets by 300,000 homes. Half of young Australians have already accepted they'll never own property. And the experts are forecasting not a correction, but a 15 to 25-year expansion that will entrench this divide permanently. I'll be covering this crisis every week, tracking the data and holding politicians accountable. Subscribe to Aussie Explained so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.